On the afternoon of July 19th, 1985, at around 2:45 p.m., a 46-year-old KGB colonel named Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky stood on Kutuzovsky Prospect in central Moscow, near a bread shop he had passed hundreds of times before. In his left hand, he held a plastic Safeway shopping bag, an item from a British supermarket chain that would have been completely ordinary in London, but was distinctly out of place in the Soviet capital. The weather that day was mild, with temperatures in the mid-60s Fahrenheit and scattered clouds moving across the sky. Gordievsky wore a gray suit, unremarkable among the pedestrians moving along the sidewalk, and carried himself with the bearing of a senior Soviet official, which is precisely what he was. What none of the people passing him that afternoon could have known was that the shopping bag he carried was not simply an imported curiosity, but a signal, a predetermined indicator to British intelligence officers watching from a distance that one of the West's most valuable intelligence assets was in immediate danger and required emergency extraction from the Soviet Union. Gordievsky stood on that corner for roughly 20 minutes, long enough for any MI6 surveillance to observe the signal, but not so long that his presence would attract attention from KGB surveillance teams that might be following him. Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowds of Moscow's afternoon pedestrian traffic, and began the most dangerous 24 hours of his life. Before we continue with how this senior KGB officer became Britain's most valuable Cold War asset and how he escaped from Moscow in one of the most daring intelligence operations in history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these documented stories of espionage every week, bringing you the real human cost behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about how an idealistic young Soviet intelligence officer transformed into a man willing to betray everything he had been raised to believe in. Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky had been born on October 10, 1938, in Moscow, into a family deeply embedded in Soviet intelligence structures. His father, Anton Gordievsky, was an NKVD officer, the predecessor organization to the KGB, who had served during the Stalinist purges and World War II. His mother, Olga, had worked as a statistician. Oleg grew up in a Moscow apartment that reflected the privileges accorded to families of the security services, more spacious than most Soviet housing, with access to special stores where goods unavailable to ordinary citizens could be purchased. The family's social circle consisted almost entirely of other NKVD and later KGB families, creating an insular world where loyalty to the Soviet state and its security apparatus was simply assumed. Oleg's older brother, Vasily, had followed their father into the intelligence services, joining the KGB in the 1950s and serving with distinction in various postings abroad. The expectation within the family was that Oleg would do the same. In his memoirs, Gordievsky later recalled that he had not questioned this path during his youth. The Soviet system was the only system he knew, and service to that system through the KGB seemed both natural and honorable. Gordievsky attended the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, an elite institution that served as a training ground for Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers. He studied languages, becoming fluent in English, German, and Danish, and was trained in the tradecraft of intelligence work, surveillance detection, recruitment techniques, secure communications, and the elaborate protocols that governed KGB operations. In 1962, at the age of 23, he was formally recruited into the KGB's first Chief Directorate, which was responsible for foreign intelligence operations. His initial assignments involved work in the Directorate's Scandinavian department, preparing him for what would become his area of specialization. In the early 1960s, Oleg married Leila Aliyeva, a woman of Armenian descent who worked as an artist and illustrator. The marriage was based on genuine affection, though it existed within the constraints and compromises that characterized most Soviet marriages among the privileged classes. They had 2 daughters, both born in the mid-1960s. The family lived in a comfortable apartment in Moscow, and Gordievsky's career progressed steadily through the KGB ranks. In 1966, Gordievsky received his first foreign posting, assigned to the KGB station in Copenhagen, Denmark, operating under diplomatic cover as a 3rd secretary at the Soviet embassy. The official duties listed in his diplomatic credentials involved cultural affairs and consular services. His actual role was as a case officer responsible for identifying and recruiting Danish citizens who might be persuaded to provide information to Soviet intelligence, monitoring political developments in Denmark, and gathering intelligence on NATO operations in Scandinavia. It was during this posting in Denmark that Gordievsky's understanding of the Soviet system and his place within it began to undergo a fundamental transformation. The catalyst, he would later explain, was the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968, roughly 2 years after he had arrived in Copenhagen. The invasion, carried out by Warsaw Pact forces to crush the Prague Spring reform movement, was justified by Soviet leadership as necessary to protect socialism from counter-revolutionary forces. Gordievsky had been raised to believe in Soviet rhetoric about liberation and anti-imperialism. The invasion of Czechoslovakia, a fellow socialist state whose government had been attempting modest reforms, contradicted those principles in ways he found increasingly difficult to rationalize. He watched Western news coverage of the invasion, something he had access to in Copenhagen that would have been impossible in Moscow, where media was entirely state-controlled. He saw images of Czech citizens confronting Soviet tanks, heard interviews with Czech intellectuals describing their hopes for reform, read analyses that framed the invasion not as liberation, but as brutal suppression. The disillusionment was gradual rather than sudden. Gordievsky continued performing his duties as a KGB officer, recruiting sources, filing reports, attending embassy functions. But internally, he began to question the fundamental premises of the system he served. He returned to Moscow in 1970 after completing his Copenhagen posting, and was assigned to the KGB's Scandinavian department at headquarters. The return to Moscow after 4 years in the relatively open society of Denmark intensified his sense of alienation. The pervasive surveillance, the restrictions on movement and information, the mandatory participation in political activities that felt increasingly hollow, all of it reinforced his growing conviction that the Soviet system was not merely imperfect, but fundamentally oppressive. In 1972, Gordievsky was posted to Copenhagen again, this time with a more senior position and expanded responsibilities. He was now 33 years old, a major in the KGB with a family and a career trajectory that suggested continued advancement within the organization. It was during this second posting in Denmark that he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. His first contact with British intelligence occurred in 1974. What is known from declassified records and Gordievsky's later memoirs is that he was approached by officers from MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, who had been monitoring his activities and had identified him as a potential recruitment target based on his behavior patterns and access to valuable intelligence. The approach was careful and gradual, designed to give Gordievsky the opportunity to decline without burning any bridges or creating a diplomatic incident. The British officers, operating under diplomatic cover at the British Embassy in Copenhagen, began with casual conversations at diplomatic functions and cultural events. They assessed Gordievsky's receptiveness, his ideological stance, and his vulnerabilities. In Gordievsky's case, the primary motivation was ideological. He had become convinced that the Soviet system was morally wrong and that he could contribute to its eventual transformation by providing intelligence to the West. The recruitment itself occurred during a walk along Copenhagen's waterfront in the spring of 1974. As Gordievsky recounted to interviewers years later, the British officer made clear what they were asking, what it would entail, what the risks were, and what support they could provide. The conversation lasted some 40 minutes. Gordievsky asked for time to consider. 3 days later, at another meeting, he agreed. From that point forward, he became one of MI6's most valuable intelligence assets, not a defector who would flee to the West, but an agent in place who would remain within the KGB while secretly working for British intelligence. The information Gordievsky provided in the years following his recruitment was extensive and consequential. As a KGB officer with access to classified cables, personnel files, operational plans, and internal assessments, he could give British intelligence unprecedented insight into Soviet intelligence operations, KGB organizational structure, and Soviet leadership thinking during a period of significant Cold War tensions. In 1975, Gordievsky completed his second tour in Copenhagen and returned to Moscow, where he was assigned to the British department of the KGB's First Chief Directorate. This posting actually increased his value to MI6 because it gave him access to all KGB operations targeting Britain, including the identities of Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in London, the names of British citizens who had been recruited as Soviet agents, and details of KGB plans for intelligence gathering in the United Kingdom. Maintaining contact with MI6 while based in Moscow was considerably more difficult than it had been in Copenhagen. Moscow was a surveillance state where KGB officers themselves were subject to monitoring by the Second Chief Directorate, which was responsible for internal counterintelligence. Any contact with Western diplomats was noted and could trigger suspicion. Instead, MI6 and Gordievsky developed elaborate procedures for communication using tradecraft methods designed to avoid detection. Dead drops, predetermined locations where packages of photographed documents could be left and retrieved, were positioned in Moscow parks, beneath park benches, inside drainage pipes, or in other locations that appeared innocuous, but were selected for accessibility while making constant surveillance difficult. Brush passes allowed materials to be transferred during brief encounters that appeared entirely innocent to observers. As two people momentarily brushed against each other in a crowded street, an envelope or small package moved from one coat pocket to another in a fraction of a second. The photography of documents was done in Gordievsky's apartment, using a miniature camera provided by MI6. He typically worked late at night after his wife and children were asleep, removing documents from his briefcase, photographing each page under a small lamp, then replacing everything exactly as it had been. The film canisters were then hidden until they could be transferred at a dead drop. The constant fear of discovery, the need to maintain perfect operational security while living a completely ordinary family life, created psychological pressures that Gordievsky would later describe as nearly overwhelming. Leila Gordievsky had no knowledge of her husband's espionage. Gordievsky made the deliberate decision not to tell her, both to protect her from the legal consequences if he were discovered, and because he did not believe she would approve or understand. Leila was not a KGB officer and did not share her husband's ideological disillusionment with the Soviet system. To reveal his espionage to her would have placed her in an impossible position. In 1982, Gordievsky received a promotion and a new posting. He was assigned to the KGB station in London, operating under diplomatic cover as counselor at the Soviet embassy. This was a significant advancement in his career and was seen by his KGB superiors as recognition of his competence and loyalty. For MI6, Gordievsky's posting to London was extraordinarily valuable. He would now be operating on British soil, where meetings with his handlers could be conducted with far greater security and frequency than had been possible in Moscow. The Gordievsky family, Oleg, Leila, and their two daughters, now teenagers, moved to London in June 1982. They were assigned to a comfortable apartment in Kensington, and the daughters were enrolled in Soviet schools for the children of diplomats and embassy staff. To external observers, the Gordievskys appeared to be a typical Soviet diplomatic family. In reality, Gordievsky's espionage activities intensified. With the cooperation of British intelligence and the relative freedom of operating in London rather than Moscow, he could meet regularly with his MI6 handlers in safe houses around London, could provide detailed briefings on KGB operations, and could photograph documents without the constant fear of discovery that had characterized his work in Moscow. Between 1982 and 1985, Gordievsky provided intelligence that proved critical to Western understanding of Soviet operations and intentions. He identified dozens of KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover in Britain, allowing MI6 to monitor their activities and neutralize their operations. He revealed the identities of British citizens who had been recruited as Soviet agents, leading to several arrests. He provided details of Soviet active measures, covert operations designed to influence British politics and public opinion through disinformation campaigns, and covert funding of sympathetic organizations. He gave insight into KGB recruitment methods and priorities, helping Western counterintelligence develop more effective defensive strategies. Perhaps most significantly, Gordievsky provided critical intelligence about Soviet leadership thinking during a period of dangerous Cold War tensions. In the early 1980s, relations between the Soviet Union and the West had deteriorated significantly. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the deployment of new Soviet intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe, and the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States had created a climate of mutual suspicion and fear. In his memoir, Gordievsky described how he was able to inform MI6 and, through them, the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies, that Soviet fears of a Western nuclear attack were genuine, not merely propaganda. Soviet leadership, particularly the aging and increasingly paranoid General Secretary Yuri Andropov, believed that NATO military exercises and Reagan's aggressive rhetoric might be preparations for an actual first strike. This intelligence was crucial because it helped Western leaders, particularly Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, understand that their rhetoric and military posturing were being interpreted by Soviet leadership as potentially indicative of actual aggressive intentions. According to historians, this intelligence contributed to a recalibration of Western policy, with Reagan moderating his rhetoric and seeking to reassure Soviet leadership through diplomatic channels. In 1984, Gordievsky was promoted to KGB resident designate in London, effectively the head of all KGB operations in Britain, though he had not yet formally assumed the position. This made him one of the most senior Soviet intelligence officers operating in the West, and gave him access to virtually all aspects of Soviet intelligence activities in Britain and, to some extent, in other Western European countries. For MI6, this was an almost unprecedented intelligence coup. They now had their own agent effectively running Soviet intelligence operations in Britain. But Gordievsky's promotion also increased the scrutiny he faced from KGB headquarters in Moscow. As resident designate, his reports and activities were reviewed at the highest levels of the First Chief Directorate. Any inconsistencies, any unusual patterns Any suggestion that he was not performing his duties with complete loyalty would be noticed and investigated. In May 1985, Gordievsky was summoned back to Moscow. The official reason given was that he was needed for consultations before formally assuming the position of resident in London. According to standard KGB procedures, such consultations were routine for officers being promoted to senior positions abroad. Gordievsky had no particular reason to suspect that the summons was anything other than what it appeared to be. He flew to Moscow on May 17, 1985, leaving his wife and daughters in London. The plan was that he would be in Moscow for about 2 weeks, would complete whatever consultations or briefings were required, and would then return to London to formally assume his position as resident. What Gordievsky did not know was that he had been betrayed. The source of the betrayal was Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who had himself been recruited by the KGB and who had begun providing the Soviets with information about American intelligence operations in April 1985, roughly 1 month before Gordievsky was summoned to Moscow. Among the information Ames provided to his KGB handlers was intelligence indicating that the KGB had a senior officer who was working for Western intelligence. Ames did not know Gordievsky's identity specifically, but the information he provided was sufficient for the KGB to narrow the list of suspects to a small number of officers, including Gordievsky. On May 22, 1985, 3 days after Gordievsky arrived in Moscow, he was taken to a KGB safe house on the outskirts of the city. At the safe house, Gordievsky was confronted by 2 KGB counterintelligence officers who informed him that he was under investigation for espionage. They did not immediately accuse him of being a British agent, but made clear that he was suspected of serious violations of security protocols and loyalty to the Soviet Union. Over the next several hours, Gordievsky was interrogated about his activities in London, his contacts with British officials, and aspects of his work that the interrogators suggested showed patterns inconsistent with loyal service. The interrogators asked specific questions about meetings, about his movements in London, about reports he had filed. They mentioned surveillance photographs. They referenced telephone intercepts. They were building a case, piece by piece, testing his responses, looking for contradictions. Gordievsky maintained his innocence. He answered questions, provided explanations for anything the interrogators claimed was suspicious, and insisted that he had always served Soviet interests faithfully. The interrogation was not physically brutal. Gordievsky was not beaten or tortured, but it was psychologically intensive, with interrogators alternating between aggressive confrontation and seemingly sympathetic conversations designed to elicit confessions. After about 8 hours, Gordievsky was released and allowed to return to his Moscow apartment, though he was informed that the investigation would continue and that he should remain available for further questioning. Over the next several weeks, Gordievsky was called in for additional interrogation sessions. He was followed whenever he left his apartment. His telephone was monitored. Friends and colleagues began avoiding him, a clear sign that word of the investigation had spread through KGB circles. Gordievsky realized that he was in serious danger. The KGB had not yet obtained sufficient evidence to arrest and prosecute him, but they clearly suspected him, and Soviet counterintelligence was methodical and patient. If he remained in Moscow, it was only a matter of time before investigators found something, a witness, a document, a surveillance recording, that would provide the evidence needed for formal charges, which would result in execution. Before Gordievsky had left London for Moscow in May, MI6 had provided him with emergency exfiltration procedures to be used if he ever found himself in immediate danger and needed to be extracted from the Soviet Union. These procedures were elaborate, and had been designed for exactly this scenario, a situation where Gordievsky could not escape through normal means, but needed to signal to British intelligence that he required emergency assistance. The signal involved standing on Kutuzovsky Prospect near the bread shop at a specific time on a Tuesday, holding the distinctive Safeway shopping bag. On July 16, 1985, Gordievsky made his decision. On the afternoon of July 19th, he executed the signal. The extraction plan that MI6 activated in response to Gordievsky's signal was complex and risky. 2 British intelligence officers would drive from Moscow toward the Finnish border in a diplomatic vehicle. Gordievsky would meet them at a predetermined location outside Moscow, would be hidden in the vehicle, and would be driven across the border into Finland, where he would be transferred to British custody. The plan relied on assumptions that could easily prove fatal if wrong. That Gordievsky could evade KGB surveillance long enough to reach the meeting point outside Moscow, that British intelligence officers could drive from Moscow to the border without being stopped and thoroughly searched, and that Soviet border guards could be deceived into not detecting Gordievsky hidden in the vehicle. On the morning of July 20th, 1985, Gordievsky left his Moscow apartment around 6:30 a.m. ostensibly to go jogging, a routine he had established over previous weeks to make his absence less suspicious. He wore jogging clothes and shoes, carried no luggage, and told his wife he would be back in an hour. Instead of jogging in his usual area, he made his way across Moscow using public transportation, taking multiple buses and metro trains, doubling back on his route, watching reflections in shop windows, and using counter-surveillance techniques he had practiced throughout his KGB career. By 8 a.m., he believed he had successfully evaded any surveillance. He reached the designated meeting point, a location about 15 miles outside Moscow on a rural road near a small forest. A British diplomatic car was waiting there, a dark sedan with diplomatic plates. The vehicle had left the British Embassy in Moscow earlier that morning on what appeared to be a routine weekend trip. 2 British intelligence officers, a man and a woman posing as a married couple, sat in the front seats. In the back seat was a baby, the child of one of the officers, brought specifically to make the scenario more believable and to create a useful distraction. Gordievsky approached the vehicle. The rear door opened. Within seconds, he was inside and being directed to a specially constructed compartment beneath the rear seat. The compartment had been built into the vehicle specifically for this operation, designed to hold a person in a space that would not be immediately visible during a standard inspection. The compartment measured roughly 3 feet by 2 feet. Gordievsky, who stood just under 6 feet tall, had to curl his body into a fetal position to fit. The British officers closed the compartment, ensuring the latches were secure but could be opened from inside if necessary. The rear seat was repositioned above him. To anyone looking into the vehicle, they would see a couple in the front seats and a baby in a car seat in the back. They would not see the senior KGB colonel hidden in a compartment beneath that seat. The drive to the Finnish border, about 500 miles from Moscow, would take nearly 12 hours, including necessary stops. The space Gordievsky occupied was dark, airless, and grew increasingly hot as the July sun beat down on the vehicle's exterior. He could hear conversations from inside the car above him, the British officers speaking to each other in English, making casual remarks about the countryside, maintaining their cover as tourists. Every bump in the road jolted his cramped body. After 2 hours, his legs began to cramp. The pain intensified, but he could not move to relieve it without risking making noise that might be heard during a stop. The temperature in the compartment climbed. He felt sweat soaking his clothes. His breathing became labored in the confined space with limited air circulation. Time lost meaning. He could not see his watch. He had no sense of how far they had traveled or how much longer the journey would take. The air grew stale. His muscles screamed. The heat became almost unbearable. He focused on breathing slowly, on remaining absolutely still, on not making any sound that might betray his presence. The compartment felt like a coffin. He thought about what would happen if he were discovered, the interrogation, the trial, the execution. He thought about his wife and daughters in London, who had no idea where he was or what danger he faced. He thought about the intelligence he had provided over 11 years, wondering if it had made any difference, if it had been worth this moment of absolute vulnerability. The British officers made several stops, to use facilities, to purchase food, to allow the baby to be fed and changed. Each stop was a moment of maximum danger. If anyone looked too carefully at the vehicle, if border patrols were conducting random searches, if KGB surveillance had somehow tracked the diplomatic car, Gordievsky would be discovered. Each time the vehicle stopped, he heard doors opening, voices outside, footsteps around the car. Then doors closing again, the engine starting, movement resuming. At around 6:30 p.m., after more than 10 hours of driving, the vehicle approached the Soviet-Finnish border, crossing at Torfyanovka. This was the moment of greatest danger. Soviet border guards routinely inspected vehicles leaving the country, particularly diplomatic vehicles which were sometimes used to smuggle items or people. If the guards decided to conduct a thorough inspection, if they asked the occupants to step out of the vehicle, if they examined the rear seat area closely, Gordievsky would be discovered. The vehicle stopped at the border checkpoint. Gordievsky, in his compartment beneath the rear seat, could hear everything. He heard the British officer in the driver's seat rolling down the window. He heard a Soviet border guard speaking in Russian, asking for documents. He heard papers being shuffled, the sound of pages being turned as the guard examined diplomatic credentials. The baby began to cry. The female British officer in the passenger seat turned to attend to the child, speaking soothingly in English. The crying intensified. The guard said something in Russian. Footsteps approached the rear of the vehicle. Gordievsky heard the rear passenger door being opened. He could hear the baby's cries clearly now, very close, directly above where he lay hidden. He could hear the female officer's voice trying to calm the child. He held his breath, every muscle tensed, waiting for the discovery that would mean his death. The guard asked a question in Russian. The British officer, speaking in accented Russian, explained they had been on a day trip to the countryside. The baby was tired and hungry. They were trying to get back to Helsinki. The guard's footsteps moved around the vehicle. Gordievsky heard the sound of the trunk being opened, items being shifted. The trunk closed. More footsteps. The rear door remained open. The baby continued crying, the sound piercing and relentless. Then the guard's voice said something that sounded like an instruction. The door closed. Footsteps moved away. The engine started. The vehicle began moving forward. They had crossed the border. After about 10 more minutes, when the vehicle had traveled several miles into Finnish territory, and the British officers were confident they were clear of any Soviet observation, they stopped. The compartment was opened. Gordievsky emerged, his body stiff and cramped from more than 12 hours in the confined space. He could barely stand. His legs refused to support his weight. The British officers helped him into the rear seat of the vehicle. The baby, no longer crying, looked at him with curious eyes. They drove to a secure location in Finland, where Gordievsky was transferred to MI6 custody. Within 24 hours, he was flown to Britain on a Royal Air Force aircraft, arriving in London on July 22, 1985. The successful exfiltration of Oleg Gordievsky was one of the most significant intelligence operations of the Cold War. For British intelligence, it represented the successful conclusion of an operation that had been running for more than a decade. For the KGB and Soviet leadership, Gordievsky's escape represented a devastating intelligence failure and a significant embarrassment. The consequences within the KGB were immediate and severe. Several officers involved in the investigation were demoted or dismissed. The entire British Department of the First Chief Directorate was reorganized. Security protocols were reviewed and tightened. There was a widespread purge of officers suspected of Western sympathies or ideological unreliability. For Gordievsky personally, the successful escape brought both relief and new challenges. He was safe in Britain and was hailed as a hero by Western intelligence services. MI6 provided him with a new identity, financial support, and assistance in establishing a new life. But the escape also meant permanent exile from his homeland and permanent separation from his family. Layla and their 2 daughters remained in Moscow. The Soviet authorities, furious about Gordievsky's defection, refused to allow them to leave the country. For years, Gordievsky had no contact with his wife or children, did not know how they were being treated, and could not explain to them why he had left or what he had been doing. Having known nothing of her husband's espionage, Layla Gordievsky found herself in an impossibly difficult position. The man who had left for routine consultations had disappeared, only to surface in British media as a defector and traitor. KGB interrogators suspected her of complicity. Other KGB families ostracized her. Soviet society shunned her. Under pressure from Soviet authorities eager to demonstrate that she maintained no loyalty to her former husband, she divorced Gordievsky in absentia. The daughters were teenagers when their father defected. They grew up in a society that viewed their father as a traitor, were questioned about whether they had known anything about his activities, and faced barriers to educational and professional opportunities because of their father's actions. Gordievsky made repeated efforts to secure permission for his family to leave the Soviet Union and join him in Britain. These efforts were unsuccessful throughout the late 1980s. The political changes that swept through the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s, including Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, eventually created new possibilities. In 1991, after years of negotiation and diplomatic pressure from the British government, Soviet authorities finally granted permission for Gordievsky's daughters to leave the Soviet Union and join their father in Britain. They had spent their entire adult lives in the Soviet Union, had developed their own lives and identities there, and carried complex feelings about their father and his choices. Layla chose not to leave the Soviet Union. She had rebuilt her life in Moscow, had no desire to relocate to Britain, and maintained resentment toward her former husband for the disruption his espionage and defection had caused. The reunion between Gordievsky and his daughters after 6 years of separation was emotional but difficult. They had lived through dramatically different experiences during that time and were essentially strangers to one another. The daughters had grown up believing their father was a traitor who had abandoned them. Gordievsky had lived with guilt about leaving them behind, but also with conviction that his espionage had been morally justified. Reconciling these perspectives required years of difficult conversations. In Britain, Gordievsky gradually built a new life. He wrote memoirs describing his experiences in the KGB and his years working for British intelligence, providing detailed accounts of Soviet intelligence operations. His books, particularly Next Stop Execution and Instructions from the Center, became important sources for historians and intelligence professionals seeking to understand the mechanics of Cold War espionage. He lectured at universities and intelligence training facilities, consulted with governments and intelligence agencies, and became a public advocate for democratic values and human rights. In 2007, Gordievsky received the Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George from the British government in recognition of his contributions to Western security. Yet the psychological cost of his double life and subsequent defection remained. Years afterward, Gordievsky spoke of experiencing guilt about those whose lives were disrupted by his defection, the difficulty of living with secrets that he could not share with most people, and the isolation that comes from having lived a life fundamentally divided against itself. In his later years, Gordievsky lived quietly in an undisclosed location in Britain, protected by British security services from potential Russian intelligence operations against him. Russian authorities had never forgiven his defection. In 2007, Russian prosecutors announced that they were bringing formal espionage charges against Gordievsky, a largely symbolic action since he was beyond Russian jurisdiction, but one that demonstrated continuing Russian anger about his defection. The question of moral responsibility in Gordievsky's case resists simple categorization. From a Soviet perspective, he was a traitor who violated oaths of loyalty, who betrayed classified information to hostile foreign intelligence services, and who potentially endangered Soviet security. From a Western perspective, he was someone who risked his life to provide intelligence that helped prevent misunderstandings that could have led to nuclear war, who exposed Soviet intelligence operations that threatened Western security, and who ultimately chose conscience over institutional loyalty when he concluded that the institution he served was morally wrong. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. Gordievsky did betray the organization he had sworn to serve. He did provide classified information to foreign intelligence services. He also provided intelligence that Western leaders found valuable and that contributed to reducing Cold War tensions at a dangerous moment. He acted according to conscience rather than for financial reward. He paid significant personal costs: separation from his family, permanent exile, lasting psychological strain, for choices he believed were ethically necessary. The impact on his family raises additional moral questions. Leila Gordievsky bore no responsibility for her husband's espionage, but suffered significant consequences nonetheless. She was suspected of complicity, was socially ostracized, lost her husband, and had to raise their daughters alone in difficult circumstances. The daughters grew up without their father, faced barriers and stigma because of his defection, and had to navigate complex feelings about a parent who chose ideological principles over family. Gordievsky expressed regret about the impact on his family, though he maintained that his espionage was morally justified and that he could not have continued to serve an organization he believed was fundamentally oppressive. This creates an ethical dilemma without easy resolution. Can personal moral convictions justify choices that impose severe costs on people who did not consent to bear those costs and had no role in creating the circumstances that led to them? The intelligence Gordievsky provided to British intelligence remained classified for many years, with details gradually being released as documents were declassified and as Gordievsky himself provided accounts in his memoirs and interviews. Among his most significant contributions, he identified Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in Western countries, allowing those countries to monitor or expel those officers. He revealed details of Soviet active measures designed to influence Western politics through disinformation and covert support for sympathetic political movements. He provided intelligence about Soviet concerns regarding Western military exercises and deployments, which helped Western leaders understand that their actions were being interpreted as potentially aggressive rather than defensive. He gave insight into KGB recruitment methods and priorities, helping Western counterintelligence develop more effective defensive strategies. The value of this intelligence is difficult to quantify in concrete terms. Intelligence rarely produces immediate, measurable outcomes. Instead, it contributes to a broader picture that informs decision-making across many areas. In the specific case of Cold War tensions in the early 1980s, Gordievsky's intelligence about genuine Soviet fears of Western nuclear attack appears to have contributed to a recalibration of Western rhetoric and policy. According to some historians, this intelligence helped Reagan and Thatcher understand that their aggressive rhetoric and military buildup, intended to pressure the Soviet Union, were actually increasing the risk of miscalculation and potentially dangerous Soviet responses. Oleg Gordievsky lived in Britain for more than 35 years after his defection, long enough to see the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the transformation of Russia. His view of these developments was complex. He had hoped that his espionage would contribute to the eventual transformation of Soviet society toward greater freedom and democracy. The collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to vindicate that hope. But the subsequent development of Russia under Vladimir Putin, with its reassertion of authoritarianism and its antagonism toward the West, suggested that the transformation had been incomplete. Gordievsky maintained that his espionage had been justified because it had contributed to Western understanding of Soviet intentions and had helped reduce the risk of nuclear war. He argued that the Cold War had been a genuine confrontation between fundamentally different and incompatible systems, and that supporting the West against the Soviet Union had been morally correct, regardless of the personal costs. His relationship with his daughters, though maintained through their adult lives in Britain, bore permanent scars from those years of separation. Oleg Gordievsky was 46 when he stood on Kutuzovsky Prospect holding a Safeway bag, signaling for extraction from a country that would have executed him if discovered. He lived another 3 decades in exile, long enough to write memoirs, receive honors, reunite with his daughters, and witness the collapse of the system he had betrayed. But he never returned to Russia, never reconciled with his former wife, and never fully escaped the isolation that comes from living a life divided against itself. Perhaps the most honest assessment is simply this: he was a human being who made choices in impossibly difficult circumstances, who acted according to his understanding of what was right while recognizing those actions would cause harm, and who lived with the consequences, both the recognition he received and the losses he endured, for the rest of his life.